always end up being the last speaker, and I'm okay with that. I want to talk to you today about a garden project that I've had going for quite a number of years, and the title of my presentation, of course, is Can a Biocultural Garden Affect Change? I'm going to do a hybrid reading a little bit, and then also sort of going through some of my slides a little bit later on. When I think about the majority of botanical gardens worldwide, they exist to discover, to disseminate, and to create knowledge about plants, and also to help their audiences do the same. However, knowledge of culture is much less often an objective in gardens, directly. Interpretation of plants within ethnobotanically focused gardens specifically typically describes plant use by a specific culture or simply plant use by humans. For me, this provides some information about a people's nature-based knowledge of the world, but it models a fairly thin representation of culture. I wondered if it were possible, perhaps, to get closer to the thick description of culture mentioned by Clifford Geertz. In particular, I wondered if a garden could help people understand the why behind actions and beliefs of any culture, specifically as it relates to the natural world. And if so, could it affect change in the structure of worldviews that then have their impact on biological and cultural diversity? At the time this idea occurred to me, I was in the midst of research with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, teaching botany and then medicinal plant classes as well. I was struck by how little students know in particular about Cherokee culture and of the ecosystem in which they live, despite being biological science students. This disconnect and the lack of quality, accurate interpretation of Cherokee culture in South Carolina, specifically in the upstate region, led me to develop the Cherokee Worldview Garden. Okay, maybe not. Physiographically, the garden is located within the Piedmont or the foothills region of South Carolina, but it's quite close to the Blue Ridge Escarpment, or the mountainous region of the state. The land in which the garden sits was once the original territory of Cherokee people. It's a small distance, as the raven flies, from the last known location of the town of Seneca. Let me show you where that's located. Well, I can see it, but you can't. Suffice it to say, it's about the distance from here to Edgeworth Dorms?
Oh.
The Dorms. Within the larger South Carolina Botanical Gardens, the garden sits on the perimeter of the Clemson University campus. The motto of South Carolina Botanical Gardens is where nature and culture meet. It's also home to an ethnobotanical garden whose focus is largely plant use by humans, but there's little to no cultural information present. So I came up with the idea of designing worldview into the context of a garden, specifically as a result of mapping the knowledge of healers. The elements of their sometimes disparate knowledge found symmetry in the lattice of worldview, some of which you'll hear about during this talk. So, how does one build worldview in a garden? How does one forward a slide?
Facing right, the thing's over there.
All right. Here you're looking at an aerial view, thanks to Kate Cummings, who presented to you all earlier, and she was thrilled to be in a plane. I was thrilled for her and jealous. Of Cherokee Worldview Garden, and just to give you a few pointers about direction, I should note, this is east. And the garden is, I'm going to do around. So it's a pretty big area. Particularly, I wanted to talk about a few elements: flow, balance, and direction. And these are my sort of shorthand ways to referring to specific parts of Cherokee people's worldview. Great. All right, so there are two elements within the context of the garden that refer specifically to water, and this is one of them. This idea originated with a student. I'll talk more on just a little bit about that. But before we actually developed the site, our intent was to install a dry creek bed. And that's, of course, because of funding restrictions. We didn't have the money to upkeep a water facility or a water feature. So we put this dry creek bed in. It's underlined with a nice layer of cloth to keep the weeds from growing up in it. The second element that's specifically tied to worldview as it relates to water is this pond right here. And here you can see the dry creek bed coming all the way from here into the pond. And actually it serves as two features. It does serve as a site for drainage on the site. So during pretty heavy rain events, it fills the pond up pretty nicely. But the pond was really an artifact or an accident of the way that the garden was built. Sometimes with backhoes things happen and you decided a design and they work really well so you keep them. So why water? Well, for Cherokee people, water is one of several natural elements that I think are incredibly important, and this really informs the way they think about many things. Cherokee people say water is, they've often referred to it as the long man with head and mouth on the coast, which I think is a beautiful way to think about water. They frequently perform going to water ceremonies, most often on a daily basis. And this can be in your home, in front of your faucet, or it most often can be in front of a creek. Where you have a specific ceremony, you go to the water, you cleanse yourself, and your day begins anew. So this picture is one of the signs that we have in the garden that helps visitors understand the importance of water to Cherokee people. One of the other elements I want to talk about too is balance. In Cherokee worldview, there's an idea of balance, and that is that if you're out of balance in mental or physical or spiritual realms, somehow you might seek the help of a healer to become in balance within life. And so this is often referred to as Biocultural, sometimes also the harmony ethic, as it's written in other documents by Cherokee people, or actually by scholars, not by Cherokee people. But it's the whole idea that you can, life is a balance. You need to maintain many sides of oneself, not only personally, but also within the community. So this just isn't a concept that applies to an individual, it's a concept that applies to a community as well. And so we built that in a couple of ways, in particular in the round structure that you all have seen from above, and let me forward to that. Okay. The structure here. And notice the fire ring in the middle, and then if you count these benches, they are 7 benches, and those refer, of course, to the 7 clans in Cherokee contemporarily. Historically, they have been more, we think. In the center fire ring is another element of theirs that speaks to life as well. Some of their major mythologies deal specifically with fire, too. If you were to be lucky enough to visit a Cherokee celebration, Cherokee religious celebration, you might find it held on ground that looked very similar to this. Where the clan benches were there was a central fire ring, and dances and song would take place in those spots. We, in the garden specifically, have not said that this is a spiritual site, because of course, despite the fact that it's very close to the original town of Seneca, it's really not our place to say that this is a spiritual site and so come use it. And so we instead tell the audience this is about the concept of balance. We want this to represent how Cherokee people have balance within and within the community. The other thing that we interpret on the site regarding worldview is sacred number and direction. So very often, Cherokee people told me that you have to know who you are in order, excuse me, I'll get this backwards. You have to know where you are in order to know who you are. So locating yourself in the context of a place is particularly important. There are 4 directions that are generally considered by Cherokee people, and those of course correspond to the cardinal directions, and then 3 additional ones in the middle, below, and above. In the middle is often referred to as heart or spirit. These, of course, add 7. We don't know if that's the reason why 7 is an important number to the tribe, but we suspect it is. And 4 is also a pretty important number to the tribe. It was important to build this into the garden specifically because we wanted people to understand in the context of medicinal practices, these things come into play every day. So if a healer applies a medicine to an individual, he's particularly going to apply that medicine in north, south, east, west direction. Perhaps have the person drink 4 times or 7 times, or perhaps drink 7 times from the vessel, or collect 7 plants. So it's kind of hard to talk about worldview because I suspect that not a lot of people know what worldview is. And so we open the garden with really what is worldview, and we give people an idea about how Cherokee people know the world. But it's not enough to sit back and signage and lecture people, so we try to include questions to get people to really think about their own worldview in the context of a garden that's designed to help them know about another culture's worldview. And so you can see these questions here, and many of the other signs have questions that you probably noticed as we've gone through. One of the other ways that we wanted to really kind of push people on the idea of culture and to try to give them some rich meaning about culture was through the plant-based signage. And when we first held committee meetings and we talked about what we might do in terms of putting a sign up that says this plant is used for medicine, people said, well, let's use a murder and pestle. I said, well, no, let's use symbols that make sense to Cherokee culture. And that makes it hard for visitors who don't understand Cherokee culture. But we have some interpretation in the context of the garden to help them understand what these symbols mean. And so this is an example I'll show you quickly. Sassafras will show them, I think, for today's speech. And this, of course, is Cherokee syllabary, their written language. This is the phonetic pronunciation of the language. And each one of these symbols corresponds to this particular plant's use. This particular symbol is related to, well, it's the tobacco flower, and that's Nicotiana rustica. And Nicotiana rustica, any plant with this one, is used for medicine. For those of you who heard earlier talks, this is a ramp. So any plant with this particular iconography is used for food. This is blowgun darts for weaponry. And this is for art or construction. And it's a symbol of the bear, which was one of the first international symbols by the tribe that went worldwide, touting the amazing artwork of Cherokee artisans. So here's the worldview. Now, how did we actually affect change? And this is a long-term process, and I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. But it began really with this idea, and then it was semester upon semester upon semester of building this with students and other faculty members. This was the site that was originally given to us. It was a dump site on the grounds of the campus. Students in landscape architecture accompanied me and their faculty member to Cherokee, North Carolina, where we held camping trips and storytelling with Native Americans around the campfire. It was great fun up on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And they learned about Cherokee culture. They came back to the site, and they were inspired to design some things that had meaning for Cherokee people and Cherokee culture. This is one of the first designs. And you can see we kept this part. Later, as the garden we got a little further on the path of development, we had students involved in taking down all kinds of kudzu that was inherent on the site, and the bricks and the mortar that were there. We had students grow plants, so we visited the Clemson Experimental Forest. We picked plants off bike trails that would otherwise been crushed. We grew them at my house because I wanted to keep them watered. And we had 700 plus plants. And these photos are all representatives of various work and people in Cherokee that I expose my students to. Some storytellers, some healers, some community members. And these community members were not only involved with my students at Cherokee, but they were also involved with my students at the site in Clemson. It's just various service projects that my students did, and also some research projects they did along the way. And I suppose I don't have any data to back up, does a biocultural garden affect change, but maybe the photos will convince you. This is the first day of installation. It was in 2005. The garden's aged a little since then. We had a little hiccup with the drought and lost quite a number of our species, and then had to redo the garden. But this was the first planting day. You can see us putting in the main feature here, and students digging in the bog at the end of the garden here. And one of my favorite photos of this young fella playing in the garden. And then later, as that garden was reclaimed in 2010 in May, we held a big celebration for the community, thanking community members, faculty members, garden staff who were important in the design. And we invited the warriors of Biocultural, who were also present, I think, for those of you who attended the Duke meeting. And this is Bo Taylor, who was formerly archivist of the museum, who's dancing here and explaining Cherokee culture to people. One of my favorites, this is the ant dance. You know, little antennas, touching each other, feeling each other. And the bear dance up here. And also the friendship dance here on the bottom. I'd like to thank you all.